London is wrapped in fog, and where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back in the game. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones and unravel new mysteries alongside him. It was one of those nights in Baker Street when the fog hung so thick upon the windows that even the gas lamps beyond could scarcely pierce it. The room was close, the fire burning cheerily, and my old friend Sherlock Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa, his long, lean form half buried in a cloud of pipe smoke. I, for my part, sat opposite him, my notes spread across my knees, for I had been attempting to bring order to a jumble of my old case records. Holmes had been silent for some time, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled before him in that attitude of meditation which was familiar to me as the prelude to some new chain of deduction. It was, I remember, shortly after the affair of the Sussex letters, and the world had given him no recent puzzle worthy of his peculiar powers. "Holmes," I ventured, "you have the air of a man starving for a mystery." He smiled faintly. "Quite so, Watson. The human mind, when deprived of stimulation, turns upon itself like a trapped creature. I confess, I should welcome even a minor enigma this evening, one with a spark of improbability, perhaps." As if summoned by his wish, there came a sudden, urgent knock upon the door below. Mrs. Hudson's steps sounded upon the stairs, and in another moment she ushered in a nervous-looking gentleman whose damp overcoat and pallid face bespoke both haste and distress. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he stammered, glancing about the room. Holmes rose, his manner all courtesy and calm. "Pray, take a seat by the fire. You have come through no pleasant weather tonight. Watson, the gentleman will perhaps favour us with his name." "Henry Fallow," said the visitor as he accepted the chair I offered. "Clerk, second class in the Foreign Office. I hardly know how to begin, Mr. Holmes. It is a matter so strange, so wholly outside the natural course of things, that I scarce dare speak of it lest you take me for a madman." Holmes regarded him with a steady, encouraging gaze. "My dear sir, I have long ceased to regard anything as impossible. State your facts precisely as they occurred." Fallow drew a trembling breath and clasped his gloved hands. "3 nights ago, I was invited to the house of my superior, Mr. Percival Greaves, at number 17, Fitzroy Square. I had certain documents for him, routine papers concerning a trade delegation. I arrived about 7:30. The servant told me Mr. Greaves was occupied and asked me to wait in the study at the end of the passage. It was a small room, plainly furnished, a writing table, a bookcase, and a single window looking onto the mews. I sat there perhaps 10 minutes, alone. When Mr. Greaves came, he apologized for the delay, and after a brief exchange I took my leave. Nothing could have been more ordinary." He paused, swallowing hard. "The next morning, I realized I had left behind my umbrella. I returned that afternoon. The same maid opened the door, but when I asked for the study, the little room at the end of the passage, she looked at me quite blankly. There was no door there at all, Mr. Holmes. Only a continuous wall, papered, plastered, solid as though no door had ever existed. The maid swore she knew of no such room, and when Mr. Greaves himself appeared, he too denied all knowledge of it. He declared the house had but 4 rooms upon that floor and invited me to see for myself. The corridor was the same, save that where the study door had been, there was now nothing but smooth panelling. My umbrella was nowhere to be found. Watson's incredulous exclamation echoed my own astonishment. But Holmes, though his eyes had kindled, remained still. "You are certain, Mr. Fallow, of the room's existence?" he asked quietly. "As certain as I am of this very room, sir. I sat there, I tell you. I observed the pattern of the carpet, the books upon the shelf, the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Unless my senses deceive me utterly, I cannot doubt what I saw." Holmes rose, crossed to the fire, and stood with his back to it, his gaze fixed upon our visitor. "You have been employed at the Foreign Office for how long?" "7 years, sir." "And your superior, Mr. Greaves, how would you describe him?" "A gentleman of good standing, reserved, recently promoted, I believe." Holmes nodded slowly. "And these documents you carried, were they of importance?" "Routine, so far as I know, but Mr. Greaves locked them away at once." "Indeed. Now, one further point. Between your first and second visits, was there any opportunity for alteration in the house? Repairs, workmen, anything of that kind?" "None that I could see." Holmes returned to his chair and leaned forward, his eyes glimmering. "A most curious circumstance, Watson. A room that existed upon one evening and the next day has vanished from the plan of the house. Vanished not in the imagination of a dreamer, but in the recollection of a man whose senses are sound and whose position forbids idle fancy. We must, I think, look into this matter." Fallow's relief was palpable. "Then you believe me, Mr. Holmes?" "I believe that you have told me the truth as you know it," Holmes said gravely. "And I perceive, moreover, that you are no longer the only person to have entered that vanished room. For there is a trace of lampblack upon your right cuff, such as would come from the smoke of a cheap oil lamp, like one used by a charwoman or servant. You did not notice it before you came here?" Fallow glanced down in astonishment. "No, indeed. How could that be?" "That, my dear sir," said Holmes, "is one of the many small questions which may lead us to a larger answer. Watson, if you have no engagement tomorrow morning, we shall take the first train to Fitzroy Square." Thus began, though we knew it not then, one of the strangest cases ever to pass through the doors of Baker Street. A case in which a room appeared for a single evening and vanished as completely as a dream upon waking. The following morning broke grey and damp, a fine drizzle falling upon the pavements, and the air heavy with the smell of soot and fog. Holmes was already astir when I came down to breakfast, his coffee untouched, his eyes alight with that peculiar brightness which to me had always signified a case worthy of his powers. "My dear Watson," he said, glancing up from a map of London spread upon the table, "our friend Mr. Fallow has provided us with a puzzle of the purest kind. No bloodshed, no violence, yet involving the complete disappearance of a room in a reputable London house. It appeals to the imagination, does it not?" "It appeals also to the reason," I replied. "A room cannot vanish without cause." "Precisely, and that is why I find it so refreshing. The case promises method rather than melodrama. We shall, I think, begin at the source." By 10 o'clock, we were in a hansom cab bound for Fitzroy Square. The city moved about us in its morning rhythm, clerks hurrying through puddles, carters shouting to their horses, the faint clatter of wheels upon the whetstones. Holmes sat wrapped in his Inverness cape, his sharp profile turned to the window. His mind, I knew, racing ahead of the cab's slow progress. Fitzroy Square lay quiet and respectable, its houses of sober brick rising 4 stories, their windows curtained, their doors freshly painted. Number 17, the residence of Mr. Percival Greaves, presented an appearance no different from its neighbours. A uniformed maid admitted us to a dimly lit hall where the smell of beeswax and coal lingered. Mr. Greaves received us in the drawing room, a tall man of some 50 years, with thinning hair, pale eyes, and a manner of studied composure. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and Dr. Watson, I presume. I cannot imagine what business brings you here, gentlemen. Holmes bowed slightly. We are here at the request of Mr. Henry Fallow, your colleague. He has reported to us a circumstance so unusual that I trust you will pardon our inquiry. Greaves's lips tightened. Ah, Mr. Fallow. Yes, he has been, I fear, somewhat overwrought of late. He appears to be under a strange delusion regarding my house. Holmes inclined his head. A delusion concerning a room, I understand. Quite so, Greaves said briskly. He imagines that there existed, off this corridor, a study or some such chamber. But as you can see, he led us to a door opening into a long passage. There is none. 4 doors only: drawing room, dining room, servants' pantry, and morning room. At the end, a wall. It has always been thus. The corridor stretched straight and narrow, the paper patterned with faded vines. At the far end, as he said, the wall appeared unbroken. Yet Holmes had stopped almost immediately upon crossing the threshold. He bent close to the panelling, examining the paper with his lens, running his long fingers along the join between wall and skirting board. Curious, he murmured. Very curious indeed. I saw then what had caught his attention. The paper, though matching in colour, bore at one section a pattern fractionally misaligned with the next, so slight that only Holmes's practised eye could have discerned it. You redecorated recently? He asked. Greaves frowned. Some minor repairs, perhaps, before I took the house last year. Nothing since. Indeed. And you employ no permanent staff? Only a cook and maid. The charwoman, Mrs. Pike, was dismissed last week. Holmes's eyes flickered. Dismissed? Why? She was slovenly and insolent. I tolerated her for a week and then sent her away. But surely such domestic matters. Holmes straightened. You are quite right, Mr. Greaves. Domestic matters are rarely of public interest, unless they concern an entire room's disappearance. Might I see the exterior of this wall from the mews behind? Greaves's irritation was evident, but he assented. We passed through the kitchen and out into the chill air of the narrow lane running behind the houses. Holmes measured the wall with his gaze, then paced the distance to the end of the building. You see, Watson, he said quietly, by my calculation, there is an interval of roughly 8 feet between the window of the morning room and the line of the kitchen. The interior passage should correspond, but inside we found only wall. That 8 feet of space must be accounted for. A builder's error, I suggested. Holmes smiled thinly. Builders make errors of inches, not of yards. No, there has been tampering here, deliberate, intelligent, and recent. We re-entered the house, but Mr. Greaves, growing visibly uneasy, declared he had official work to attend to and could not spare more time. Holmes thanked him courteously, and we withdrew. Outside, in the pale drizzle, he hailed a cab and gave the driver an address in Bloomsbury. We shall pay a call upon Mr. Fallow, he said, and verify certain details. At Fallow's modest lodgings, the clerk received us eagerly. His manner was that of a man clinging to sanity in the face of disbelief. He described again, with painful precision, the vanished study, the narrow window, the ticking clock, the green curtain. When Holmes questioned him, his answers were consistent and exact. "Did you observe the wallpaper, Mr. Fallow?" "Yes. Striped, I think, a dull greenish colour, and there was a smell of paint, as if the room had been recently done." "Excellent. And you were certain the door was at the very end of the passage?" "Beyond doubt. It opened inward, and the hinges were on the right." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook, then said, "You mentioned a maid. Did you see her that evening?" "No. Mr. Greaves admitted me himself." Holmes nodded. "And when you returned the next day, the same maid denied all knowledge?" "She looked frightened, sir. Frightened rather than puzzled. That is what struck me." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "Thank you, Mr. Fallow. That is most helpful." When we had taken our leave, he remained silent until we were halfway down the street. Then he said, "Watson, it grows more interesting. The frightened maid, the dismissed charwoman, the unexplained 8 feet of vanished space. Each points to a contrivance both clever and temporary. I suspect our mysterious Mrs. Pike is a woman of unusual talents." We returned to Baker Street by late afternoon. Holmes spent the evening consulting directories, sketching measurements, and comparing notes. He spoke little, but once I heard him mutter, "It is not the vanishing of the room that puzzles me, but its purpose." When at last the fire burned low, he laid aside his pencil and said, "Tomorrow, my dear Watson, we shall pay another visit to Fitzroy Square, but at night. There are certain sounds which the ear may catch more readily when honest folk are abed." And so it was arranged. Little did I suspect, as I extinguished the lamp, that before the week was out, we should stand within that same corridor, face to face with the truth behind the room that appeared only once. The next evening was raw and gusty, with the wind sweeping through the narrow streets and scattering the refuse along the curbstones. Clouds pressed low upon the rooftops, and the lamps burned like dull orange smudges in the mist. Holmes, muffled in his heavy coat, strode briskly at my side, his mood one of suppressed energy. "Watson," said he as we turned into Fitzroy Square, "there are few things more instructive than to observe a place by night after seeing it by day. The eye then perceives what habit conceals, the movements that occur when honest daylight no longer restrains the less reputable elements of society." We halted before number 17. The house stood in darkness, save for a faint glow behind a curtain on the upper floor. Holmes's gaze roamed over every feature of the facade, the angle of the steps, the alignment of the windows. Then, without a word, he moved along the mews to the rear, where the wind moaned between the close brick walls. The back of the property was partially lit by a distant lamp. The wet cobbles gleamed faintly. Holmes drew from his pocket a small dark lantern, masking the light with his fingers as he examined the wall we had measured the day before. He ran his hand over the brickwork, tapping here and there. At one spot, the sound changed, hollow, resonant. "A temporary partition," he whispered. "Thin boards plastered over, then faced with paper. Observe, there is a hairline crack where the damp has swollen the edge. I think our missing room stood exactly here." With the point of his penknife, he scraped at the mortar. A A flake came away, exposing fresh wood beneath. He smiled slightly. A hasty piece of joinery. Whoever built it was pressed for time. Then, Holmes, I murmured, you believe the room was real, after all. As real as you or I, my dear Watson. The illusion lies only in its disappearance. He stepped back, shading his lantern, and surveyed the lane. All was still. A cat darted across the cobbles, and from far off came the clang of a distant hansom. "Let us retire," he said. "There is no advantage in being discovered here. We have seen enough to plan the next step." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent half the night at his chemistry table, heating small samples of plaster and examining the dust he had gathered upon his fingers. I could not resist remarking upon the peculiarity of such labours. "Surely, Holmes, you are not preparing to turn mason?" He looked up from his lens. "Not mason, Watson, merely student. You recall, perhaps, that certain builders use a compound mixed with ground shellac. It dries quickly but cracks after a few days if applied in haste. That is what I have found here. Our mysterious constructors worked by night, erected their partition swiftly, and removed it with equal dispatch." "But to what end?" I persisted. "Why construct a room merely to take it down again?" He smiled faintly. "Patience. The motive will follow the method. A room that exists for one night only must serve a purpose as fleeting as itself. The question is, what was hidden within those walls?" For 2 days, Holmes disappeared upon errands of his own. He returned on the 3rd evening, his boots muddy, his expression grimly satisfied. "Watson," said he, "our Mr. Greaves is a man of interesting habits. His reputation at the Foreign Office is spotless, yet within the last fortnight he has been observed visiting a disreputable establishment near the docks, a public house frequented by smugglers and sailors of various nations. He went there in the company of a woman answering to the name Pike." "The charwoman?" "The same. But Mrs. Pike, I now learn, is no humble cleaner. She is, in fact, Mary Pike, once charged with theft of official correspondence in the service case of '92, though she escaped through lack of proof. It seems she has resumed her old trade, and Mr. Greaves has been most unwise in his choice of acquaintance." He threw a small newspaper clipping upon the table. It was an account of a missing diplomatic pouch, stolen from the Foreign Office dispatch room 3 weeks earlier. There, Watson, lies the heart of our mystery. I suspect that pouch found temporary concealment within the vanished room. That night, at Holmes's insistence, we made a second nocturnal expedition to Fitzroy Square, this time not as passive observers. Holmes carried a bundle of tools within his coat and a coil of stout twine. The rain had ceased, but the fog hung heavy. Number 17 was silent and unlit. By means I shall not describe too closely, Holmes gained us entrance through the area door. We crept along the corridor like thieves, though my conscience was easy, knowing our object was justice. Holmes halted at the wall where the missing door had once stood. "Listen," he breathed. From within came a faint, rhythmic sound, scrape, pause, scrape again, as of metal upon wood. Holmes's hand shot out, touching my sleeve. "Someone is working behind that wall." He drew a thin-bladed instrument from his pocket and slid it along the edge of the skirting. There was a soft crack. A panel moved outward a fraction. Through the narrow gap filtered a thread of light. Holmes pushed gently, and a section of the wall swung inward upon concealed hinges. We were looking into a narrow space, no larger than a cupboard, but sufficient to contain a table, a lamp, and a small strongbox upon the floor. Bending over the box, her back toward us, was a woman in a coarse shawl, the infamous Mrs. Pike herself. Her hands were busy with a chisel and a length of wire. Holmes stepped forward, the lantern beam striking her face. She spun around with a gasp, her features hard and cunning. "Good evening, Mrs. Pike," said Holmes quietly. "You have chosen an inconvenient hour for your housekeeping?" The woman stared from him to me, her eyes narrowing. "So, you've found it, have you? Well, you're too late." With astonishing swiftness, she snatched up the lamp and hurled it to the floor. The oil flared, smoke filling the narrow space. Holmes sprang upon her, wrenching the strongbox from her grasp. She struggled like a wildcat, but he was the stronger. Together we dragged her into the passage and stamped out the flames. Within minutes, the commotion had roused the household. Mr. Greaves appeared in a dressing gown, his face ashen. When he beheld the scene, Holmes with the box, the woman restrained by my arm, his composure deserted him utterly. "Good heavens!" he cried. "What does this mean?" "It means, Mr. Greaves," said Holmes sternly, "that your accomplice has chosen a poor hiding place. This, I think, is the missing Foreign Office dispatch." He tapped the box significantly. Greaves stammered something incoherent, then made a sudden dart toward the door. Holmes's arm shot out, and the man was flung backward against the wall. "Not so fast," Holmes said coldly. "The explanation will keep till morning." And so we stood amid the smoke and confusion, with the remnants of the false wall gaping behind us. A secret chamber laid bare, its brief purpose ended. The room that appeared only once had yielded its first secret, though many details were still to come. Holmes turned to me, his eyes bright in the flickering light. "Watson, fetch the constable from the corner. I believe our night's work has borne fruit at last." When I returned, breathless from the damp street, Holmes was seated calmly in an armchair, the iron box open before him. Inside, neatly folded, lay a bundle of official papers bearing the crimson seal of the Foreign Office. He closed the lid, locking it with care. "An affair of state, my dear Watson," he said quietly. "We shall have a busy day tomorrow." Thus ended that extraordinary night, one that I shall never forget, for it was the first time I saw a wall open like a curtain and reveal the machinery of deceit hidden within a gentleman's home. The mystery, however, was far from complete, and I could not then guess the deeper treachery which still lay concealed beneath the surface of the case. The following morning broke bleak and windswept, the kind of London dawn that paints the city in tones of slate and ash. I had slept little, for the images of the night, Mrs. Pike's defiant face, the flare of the burning lamp, the strange hollow echo of the secret chamber, haunted my mind. When I descended to breakfast, I found Holmes already in his armchair, the recovered dispatch box upon the table before him. Its lid lay open, revealing several thick packets of folded papers, bound in red tape. "Good morning, Watson," he said, his voice brisk, though his eyes bore traces of fatigue. "I have already sent word to Inspector Lestrade. We may expect him shortly. Meanwhile, we may profitably consider what the events of last night reveal." I seated myself opposite him. "I confess, Holmes, the matter remains clouded to me. Mrs. Pike and Mr. Greaves appear to have conspired in the theft of these documents. But to what end? And why such elaborate measures to conceal them? Ah, my dear Watson, your questions go to the very heart of the case, said Holmes, leaning forward. Let us reconstruct the sequence. A diplomatic pouch disappears from the Foreign Office. Those responsible must find a place of concealment until the papers can be sold or smuggled abroad. But the police, alerted at once, search all suspected persons and premises. The conspirators therefore require a hiding place, one secure, unsuspected, and, above all, temporary. What better than a false room within a respectable house? But why Mr. Greaves's house in particular? Because, as an official of the Foreign Office, his home would be above suspicion. His connection would ensure that no search warrant would ever disturb him. The room was constructed swiftly, perhaps in a single night, with the assistance of Mrs. Pike, who no doubt engaged workmen of her acquaintance under some plausible pretext. The dispatch box was hidden there until the hue and cry subsided. Once it was safe, the room was dismantled, the papers to be retrieved later under cover of darkness. I nodded slowly. And Mr. Fallow, by chance, was shown into that same room. Precisely. His visit was unexpected. Greaves, taken unawares, allowed him to wait there, supposing him too preoccupied to notice details. But Fallow's memory proved inconveniently exact, and when he returned for his umbrella, he found the deception exposed by its own perfection, the room erased as if it had never existed. As Holmes spoke, the door opened and Lestrade entered, brisk and businesslike, his small figure wrapped in an overcoat that dripped with the morning mist. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. I had your message. What's this about a recovered dispatch box?" Holmes gestured toward the table. "You will find, Inspector, that the Foreign Office may soon rest easier. These are the missing documents." Lestrade's eyes widened as he examined the seals. "Bless my soul, it's the genuine article. How in heaven's name?" Holmes waved a hand. "You will find the details in my report. Suffice it to say that both the thief and his accomplice are under lock and key. Mrs. Pike was conveyed to the yard early this morning, and Mr. Greaves remains in custody." Lestrade gave a low whistle. "We've wanted that woman for years. A clever one she is. But Greaves, well, that'll shake the whole department." When he had gone, Holmes leaned back and regarded the ceiling thoughtfully. "It is remarkable, Watson, how the human conscience may contrive to justify itself. Greaves will doubtless claim that he was driven by financial pressure, or perhaps by fear of exposure in some earlier indiscretion. But such excuses never suffice. The habit of deceit grows like a fungus. Once it takes hold, it spreads through the entire system. Later that day, at Holmes's request, we attended the official inquiry at the Foreign Office. The matter, though hushed from public notice, had thrown the department into turmoil. Mr. Greaves, pale and haggard, sat between two constables, while a secretary read aloud his confession. It appeared that he had been approached by foreign agents promising large sums in exchange for the confidential dispatches. Mrs. Pike, acting as intermediary, had devised the plan of the disappearing room. The documents were to be handed over in due course, but Holmes's timely intervention had thwarted the scheme before the final act could be played. When we emerged into the cold air, Holmes drew his cloak close about him. "A sordid business, Watson. Yet the ingenuity of their method is almost admirable. I suspect, however, that we have not yet reached the true end. I looked at him in surprise. Not the end. Surely the case is complete. He shook his head. I think not. Greaves and the woman Pike are but the visible instruments. There remains the question of who stood behind them, who conceived the theft, provided the funds, and waited to profit by the betrayal. Such a man would not trust his agents entirely, and he will not rest content while they remain silent in prison. His words proved prophetic. 3 nights later, I was roused from sleep by a knock at my door. Holmes stood there, fully dressed, his expression grave. "Watson, the guard at Holloway has been found unconscious. Mrs. Pike has escaped." We hurried to the scene at once. The facts were startling. A stranger, posing as a solicitor, had gained admission to the prison, bearing forged credentials. Within an hour of his visit, Mrs. Pike was missing, the lock of her cell opened by a master key. The man had vanished as completely as she. Holmes paced the warden's office with long strides, his brow furrowed. "You see, Watson, the invisible hand moves again. Our unseen principal has reclaimed his servant. He fears her tongue." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent the night in restless thought. At dawn, he said quietly, "She will attempt to flee the country. There are only 3 routes open to her: the train to Dover, the steamer from Tilbury, or the packet from Hull. Lestrade will cover Dover. We shall attend to Tilbury." By evening, we were on the platform at Fenchurch Street Station. The lamps flickered above the damp rails, and the air smelled of coal and salt. Holmes's keen eyes scanned every passenger who passed toward the waiting train. Suddenly, he gripped my arm. "There, Watson, by the 3rd carriage." A woman in a heavy veil moved swiftly along the platform, a small valise in her hand. She glanced once behind her, and in that instant Holmes was certain. We followed her to the carriage and entered the adjoining compartment. As the train jolted into motion, Holmes stepped through the connecting door. "Good evening, Mrs. Pike," he said softly. The veil was thrown back with a cry of rage and despair. The face beneath was indeed that of the fugitive woman. She stared at him as though at an apparition. "You again," she whispered. "Do you never rest?" "Only when justice sleeps," he returned. "You are under arrest. The next station will suffice for our purpose." But before the words had left his mouth, she sprang toward the open window. The night air rushed in with a roar. I caught her arm, but she wrenched free with desperate strength and flung herself into the darkness. The train thundered on. We pulled the cord. When at last the carriages ground to a halt and the lamps of the guards' lanterns flickered along the track, there was no sign of her. Only the endless sweep of the marshes, silent beneath the pale stars. Holmes stood looking out into the gloom. "She has escaped us, Watson. Whether to her death or to her freedom, who can say? But the true villain still moves in shadow. We must draw him into the light." He closed the window and sank into the seat opposite me, his face unreadable. "The game, my dear friend, is not yet finished. The room that appeared only once has yet another secret to tell." The weeks that followed were among the most curious of my association with Sherlock Holmes. Mrs. Pike's vanishing act had stirred every division of Scotland Yard into motion, and yet not a whisper of her whereabouts could be traced. The river police dragged the Thames for 3 days, finding nothing. The ports were watched. Descriptions circulated through every telegraph office in the kingdom. It was as though the woman had dissolved into the London fog. Holmes, though outwardly calm, was not idle. He spent long hours in his armchair, his eyes half closed, his pipe cold between his fingers, while his mind travelled through unseen channels of reasoning. When he spoke, it was often in abrupt sentences that seemed to belong to some internal conversation. "Watson," he said one morning, "when an enemy vanishes, it is generally because he has gone to ground among his friends. We must seek the woman not where she was least welcome, but where her trade and her nature find sympathy." "And where would that be?" I asked. "In the underworld of London, where secrets are currency and disguise is an art form. She will return to familiar soil. The question is, what business brings her back?" I saw him dispatch several notes by messenger that day. By evening, strange visitors appeared at Baker Street. A ragged crossing sweeper, a cabman with an accent from the docks, even a street violinist whom I recognized as one of Holmes's numerous informants. Each came, muttered a few words in low tones, and departed. When the last had gone, Holmes turned to me with a glimmer of satisfaction. "She has been seen," he said. "Our errant charwoman is alive, and she is playing a more dangerous game than before. 2 nights ago, she was observed near Limehouse in the company of a man calling himself Mr. Delver, a name which conceals more than it reveals. He is reputed to deal in information and occasionally in lives. If he is who I believe, he once served as a courier for certain foreign agents. You see the pattern emerging. The same agents for whom Greaves stole the documents. Exactly. The threads converge. That evening we set out for Limehouse. The air was thick with smoke from the river steamers, and the streets twisted through dim alleys that smelt of tar and damp timber. At last we reached a tavern called the Mermaid's Tail, a squalid haunt frequented by sailors of every flag. Holmes entered with the assured step of one who belongs anywhere he pleases. He ordered 2 glasses of gin and surveyed the room through the haze of tobacco. "Do you observe the man in the far corner, Watson? Short, compact, with a scar across his cheek. That is Delver." We waited until he rose, then followed him out into the night. He led us through a labyrinth of alleys to a small warehouse by the river, where a dim light burned through a shuttered window. From within came the murmur of voices. Holmes crept forward, motioning me to silence. We could just discern the words. "It's too dangerous," said a woman's voice, hoarse, hurried. "They'll hang me if I'm caught again." "The boss doesn't forget his friends," came the man's reply. "You deliver what's left of the papers, and you're clear. Passage to Antwerp and a new name." "I told you, Greaves destroyed half before they were seized. The rest were taken by that devil Holmes." Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve. His whisper was scarcely audible. "So, she confesses her master still lives. Greaves destroyed part of the evidence, but there was something more, something he kept back." A floorboard creaked under my foot. Instantly, the voices ceased. The door was flung open, and the beam of a lantern struck us. "It's the police!" cried Delver. He dashed for the river, with Holmes in pursuit. Mrs. Pike slipped past me like a shadow, her shawl brushing my arm. I caught her wrist, but she struck me across the face with a strength that belied her frame and vanished down a passage. I followed. the echo of her steps guiding me through the maze of planks and crates until I burst out onto the wharf. The tide was high, the river black and restless under the lamps. Holmes appeared beside me, panting, his coat torn. "Delver's gone into the water," he said grimly. "The current will carry him far before the police nets can reach him. And the woman. Gone too. She must have known the river better than we." He looked out over the dark surface. "So ends the lesser villain." But her words were gold, Watson. She confirmed a fact I suspected. Greaves's destruction of the documents was partial. There remains a fragment, something still missing, and it is of greater value than all the rest. The following day, Holmes spent at the British Museum, poring over foreign newspapers. When I returned in the evening, I found him writing rapidly at his desk. "The cipher, Watson," he exclaimed, eyes gleaming. It was not the documents themselves that our unknown employer desired, but the code they contained. A diplomatic cipher used only in confidential correspondence with the British Embassy in Vienna. Greaves destroyed the papers, but preserved the cipher key, intending to sell it separately. It must be hidden somewhere he believed safe. "In his house?" Holmes nodded. "Most likely. But he would not entrust it to ordinary concealment. No, Greaves was a man of habits, methodical, secretive. He would choose a place familiar yet secure. That night, we obtained permission to re-examine number 17 Fitzroy Square. The house was now under guard. Its former respectability turned to infamy. Holmes moved through the rooms like a hound upon a scent, pausing at intervals, tapping the panels, studying the pattern of the floorboards. In the study, Greaves's own private room, he halted before a tall bookcase filled with volumes of law and diplomacy. His long fingers drew out one after another until they stopped upon a thick ledger bound in green leather. "Ah," he murmured, "our man's weakness, consistency. He could never resist alphabetical order. See, France, Germany, Russia, and here, Vienna." He opened the volume. Between the pages lay a small envelope sealed with wax. Holmes broke it gently. Inside was a slip of paper covered in tiny figures and symbols. "The cipher key," he said simply, "the very heart of the matter." I bent closer. "But Holmes, how could you possibly know it would be here?" He smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, when a man constructs a room to vanish, he forgets that the mind which builds false walls must still return home to rest. Greaves's mind was a map of his own deception. I merely followed its contours." We replaced the book and carried our find to Scotland Yard, where Lestrade received it with astonished gratitude. "You've done the government a great service, Mr. Holmes," he said warmly. "This will put an end to the affair once and for all." But Holmes, lighting his pipe, shook his head. "Not quite, Inspector. There is still a hand unseen, the one that guided Greaves and Pike both. Until I have traced that hand to its wrist, the case remains open." And so, the shadows lengthened once more around the mystery. Mrs. Pike's fate was uncertain. Delver's body never recovered, and somewhere in the smoke of London, a man moved who had profited by both their ruin. Holmes had drawn aside one veil only to find another waiting beyond it. That night, as the wind rattled the window panes of Baker Street, he stood looking into the fire and said softly, "Watson, the most dangerous enemy is not the one who builds a false room, but the one who knows how to vanish within it." It was late in February when the next movement in that strange affair occurred. London lay beneath a bitter frost, and the air, sharpened by the east wind, turned every breath into a cloud of white. Holmes had fallen again into one of his restless moods, those silent intervals when his mind, denied the stimulus of a fresh mystery, brooded upon unseen problems. The case of the vanishing room seemed to have reached its conclusion, yet I could tell from his manner that he was far from satisfied. "Watson," he said one evening as we sat by the fire, "have you ever observed how a crime seldom ends where the law assumes it does? The arrest, the confession, even the punishment, these are but the surface ripples. Beneath, the current flows on. The true intelligence behind the act may remain untouched. You still believe that Greaves and Mrs. Pike were not the originators? Beyond question, they were agents, useful tools, but incapable of conceiving such an intricate scheme. There was another mind at work, more patient, more disciplined, a man accustomed to strategy rather than impulse." He rose, paced the length of the sitting room, and halted before the window. The night outside was black, save for the faint gleam of the gaslight upon the falling snow. "This hidden figure, Watson, will reveal himself. For men of intellect, however careful, cannot resist the temptation to demonstrate their superiority. They must leave their signature, even upon crime." At that very instant there came a sharp knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. "Urgent. Come at once. Lestrade, Fitzroy Square." Within 15 minutes we were in a cab, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the frozen stones. At number 17 we found Lestrade waiting upon the steps, his breath steaming in the cold. "Another turn in your case, Mr. Holmes," he said. "The constable on duty heard a crash about an hour ago. When he entered, he found the study in confusion and something very singular besides." We followed him inside. The house, long since vacated, echoed under our steps. In the study, the very room where Holmes had discovered the cipher key, books were strewn across the floor, the drawers forced open. Upon the writing desk lay a single sheet of paper, pinned by a knife. Holmes bent over it. "A message," he murmured. "And see, written in red ink, dramatic but childish." He read it aloud. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you have meddled in affairs beyond your comprehension. The game is not ended. The room will appear again, and you will not find the door." Lestrade gave a low whistle. "A threat, eh? Whoever left this has a taste for theatrics." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "Not theatrics, Inspector. Communication. Observe the phrasing. The room will appear again. That implies both confidence and control. Our adversary intends to repeat his experiment. But on what stage?" He examined the knife, turning it in the lamplight. "A common blade, manufactured in Birmingham, sold by the dozen. But the handwriting, yes, that is another matter." He drew his lens from his pocket. "Curious. The letters slope downward to the right, the hand of a man accustomed to writing in haste, perhaps upon a slanted surface, say a ship's desk. The ink is of inferior quality, tinged with salt. Our correspondent has recently been at sea." Lestrade looked astonished. "You mean to say he's a sailor? Or one who would pass for such? At any rate, a man with knowledge of navigation, possibly foreign, but fluent in English idiom. Watson, note the choice of words. You will not find the door. That is not mere bravado. It is a riddle." Holmes folded the note and placed it in his pocket. "Inspector, Double the guard upon this house. Let no one enter without my written order. Our visitor may yet return to complete his mischief. We drove back to Baker Street in silence. I could see that my companion's mind was racing. Once there, he spread maps, directories, and coded notes upon the table. For an hour he worked without speaking. At last, he turned to me. "Watson, what is the one feature that connects Fitzroy Square to the docks of Limehouse?" I considered. "The Regent's Canal," I said. "Precisely. A direct waterway, little used at night, yet providing discreet access from the river. Our friend may have employed it to transport his materials, the boards, the plaster, all that was needed to construct his phantom chamber. A clever stratagem, but it suggests he must possess property or friends along the canal. The next morning found us walking the length of that dreary thoroughfare, its frozen surface reflecting the grey light like dull steel. At intervals, Holmes paused to question boatmen or warehouse clerks, showing them the note and inquiring whether they had seen a man matching the suspected description, a lean figure, perhaps foreign, with the bearing of a seaman. By the fourth warehouse, our persistence was rewarded. "Aye, sir," said an old bargeman, scratching his chin. "There's one fits that talk. Calls himself Captain Rokes. Rented a store by the lock 3 weeks ago. Boards, tools, plaster, same as you say. Comes and goes at odd hours. Paid in gold, he did." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Thank you, my man. You may have helped to uncover something of national importance." That evening, as dusk fell over the canal, we took our stand near the lock house, concealing ourselves among the stacked crates. Presently, a lantern's glow approached along the towpath. The figure who bore it was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat, a cap pulled low over his brow. He unlocked the door of the store and vanished inside. Holmes touched my arm. "Our quarry, Watson. Now we shall see the room that appears again." We crept forward, peering through a crack in the wooden wall. The interior was dimly lit. The man, Captain Rokes, if such he was, worked with silent precision, fitting together panels, measuring, hammering. Before our eyes, a partition took shape, transforming the warehouse into 2 chambers. Holmes's whisper was tense. "You see? The same method as before. A false wall, a hidden compartment. But for what purpose here?" Suddenly, a faint sound behind us made us turn. A shadow loomed in the gloom. Before I could cry out, a blow struck my shoulder, and I staggered. A second figure had crept upon us. Holmes grappled with him. The lantern inside crashed to the floor, plunging everything into darkness. There followed a confused struggle. Blows, curses, the scuffle of boots on wood. I fired my revolver once, the flash revealing the contorted faces of our assailants. Then silence, save for the hiss of the extinguished flame and the slow lapping of the canal beyond. When the light was restored, one man lay bound upon the floor, Rokes himself, while the other had vanished into the night. Holmes's face was pale but composed. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have taken the mask, but not the mind. This man is a servant, not a master. Yet his work confirms my fear. The disappearing room is to be used again. Only this time, I suspect, not for concealment, but for murder." He knelt beside the captive and examined a notebook taken from his pocket. "Ah, here are sketches, addresses, and one entry that chills even me. March 4th, Baker Street." He looked up sharply. "It appears, my dear Watson, that the next room to vanish may be our own. For the next 48 hours, I scarcely left Holmes's side. The discovery of that ominous note, March 4th, Baker Street, had shaken me profoundly, though Holmes, outwardly calm, moved with the cold precision of a chess player confronted by an unexpected gambit. He treated the threat not with fear, but with scientific curiosity. "My dear Watson," he said, lighting his pipe as though nothing had occurred, "it is both flattering and inconvenient to become the subject of one's own case. Still, the enemy who announces his move rarely strikes without purpose. Our task is to determine what lies behind this melodramatic warning." Lestrade had taken Rokes into custody, but the man maintained an obstinate silence. He gave his name and little more, and even that might have been false. The police could trace no record of him, though his speech and bearing betrayed a seaman's training. The notebook Holmes had seized was more revealing. Several coded entries, diagrams of walls and measurements, and at the bottom of one page, a small sketch of our very sitting room at 221B Baker Street. When Holmes spread those drawings upon the table, I confess a chill ran through me. "Surely, Holmes," I exclaimed, "you do not suppose they intend to construct one of their infernal partitions here, in our rooms?" "I think it highly probable," he replied, puffing thoughtfully. "We have been observed, Watson, perhaps for weeks. You recall the peddler who lingered at the corner opposite? The errand boy who pretended to lose his parcel at our steps? Agents, beyond doubt. They would need accurate knowledge of the rooms before attempting such a feat." "But to what end?" I cried. "What can they hope to achieve by building a wall in your own lodgings?" He smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, the answer is simplicity itself. If the first room concealed a theft, the second may conceal us. Consider the possibilities. A man could vanish from his home, leaving no trace, swallowed as it were by the very walls. The newspapers would call it a miracle. The world would whisper that Sherlock Holmes had met his match. It is, I suspect, a challenge, a demonstration." He rose, restless, pacing the hearthrug. "The intellect behind these events is not content with money or power. It seeks triumph of a different kind, one of mind over mind. We are dealing, Watson, with a criminal who regards his work as art." From that hour, our rooms became a fortress. Holmes inspected every beam and panel, every inch of flooring. He sent Mrs. Hudson to stay with her sister in Hampstead, declaring that her nerves were not equal to the experiment which may shortly take place. For myself, I followed his instructions with a mixture of apprehension and admiration. The old instincts of a soldier stirred within me. If there was to be a siege, I was ready for it. On the evening of March 3rd, Holmes received a telegram. He read it, and without a word, tossed it into the fire. I caught only a fragment as it curled in the flames. "Tomorrow night, Canal." He turned to me. "Watson, we shall expect visitors. Be so good as to see that your revolver is loaded, and keep that stout walking stick within reach. I imagine the next 24 hours will resolve the affair." The day that followed was unnaturally calm. Holmes spent it in what seemed idle activity, playing the violin, reading scraps of old newspapers, even lounging by the window to watch the street below. Only by the set of his jaw and the occasional narrowing of his eyes did I perceive the tension beneath. As twilight deepened into night, a thick fog rolled up from the river, muffling the clang of distant hansoms. Holmes drew down the blinds, trimmed the lamp, and seated himself opposite the door. "Now we wait," he said simply. Hours passed in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Midnight struck, then 1. My eyes grew heavy, but Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the corner near the bookcase. Suddenly, he raised a finger. "Listen." At first, I heard nothing. Then, from beyond the wall that bordered Mrs. Hudson's former sitting room, came a faint, deliberate tapping, like the cautious stroke of a hammer upon wood. Holmes's expression hardened. As I suspected, they have chosen the rear wall. It faces the alley and may be reached through the empty rooms below. Stay here, Watson, but be ready. He vanished into the corridor. I waited, revolver in hand, every nerve alert. The tapping ceased. A moment later, Holmes's voice called softly, "Come." I found him in the passage, holding his lantern close to the wall. A thin line, scarcely perceptible, had appeared along the plaster, a fresh join. From behind it came the faint smell of sawdust. "They have begun," he said grimly. "We shall let them proceed a little further. There is more to be learned from watching than from interference." We retreated into the sitting room. For another half hour, the muffled sounds continued, scraping, hammering, the creak of boards being fitted. Then silence. Holmes motioned for me to extinguish the lamp. We waited in darkness, the fog outside pressing against the panes. Without warning, a portion of the wall opposite us moved inward by the breadth of an inch. Through the narrow crack filtered a thread of light. A hand appeared, then another, silhouetted against the glow. 2 men stepped noiselessly through the opening, carrying between them a heavy object wrapped in canvas. Holmes whispered, "Do not move." They set the bundle down, and one of them, tall, broad-shouldered, turned to close the hidden door. In the faint light, I recognized the harsh profile of our prisoner, Rokes. The other, however, was a stranger, thin, elegant, with a face of almost scholarly refinement. He wore no mask. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. "There," he breathed, "is the mind behind the room." The stranger spoke in a low, commanding tone. "Quickly now. Set it there by the hearth. When the plaster sets, no one will suspect. He will be found in the morning, suffocated, silent, encased in his own wall." The horror of it struck me dumb. They meant to entomb Holmes, alive, within the very room he had made famous. Before I could act, Holmes was already in motion. With a cry that rang through the flat, he leapt forward, striking the lamp from their hands. The room plunged into darkness. There followed a fierce struggle, the crash of furniture, the thud of blows. I fired once, the flash illuminating a whirl of faces and flailing arms. Then came a heavy fall and the sound of someone fleeing down the stairs. When the lamps were relit, Rokes lay bound and groaning upon the carpet. The stranger had vanished, leaving behind only the canvas bundle, an airtight box large enough to contain a man. Holmes straightened his coat and looked at me with a wry smile. "You see, Watson, the prophecy was nearly fulfilled. The room did appear again, but the door, fortunately, was not beyond our finding." He turned to the captive. "Take comfort, my friend. You will have excellent company in Newgate, though I fear your master has once again escaped into the shadows. But he will return. Men of his kind always do, for pride is a leash they cannot cut. That night, as the constables led Rokes away and the fog began to thin before dawn, Holmes stood by the window, his figure dark against the paling sky. "The case is not ended," he murmured. "There remains a mind abroad in London that builds walls not of wood and plaster, but of silence and fear. Yet even walls, Watson, leave traces, and it will be my business to find them. The events of that ghastly night left me sleepless. Long after the constables had gone, I sat beside the fire, watching the embers die and listening to the distant rattle of carriages in the street below. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by the danger, as though the brush with death had kindled his faculties rather than dulled them. At dawn, I found him at the table, his violin beside him, a sheet of notes spread before him, and a cup of untasted coffee at his elbow. "Watson," he said without looking up, "do you know what troubles me about our adversary?" "That he escaped," I ventured. "Escape is a detail. No, it is that he warned us. A true assassin strikes from the shadows. But this man, this architect of deceit, craves recognition. He wished us to know of his design before he carried it out. It is art to him, not crime." "An artist in murder," I said grimly. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. That vanity will be his undoing." He rose abruptly and paced to the window, his lean figure outlined against the pale winter light. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the busy street below. "Do you recall, Watson, the first note found in Fitzroy Square? The threat that the room would appear again? That phrase was not metaphor. It was a plan. The man who wrote it considers himself a craftsman, repeating his masterpiece upon a grander stage each time. But now that his hand has been exposed, he will not flee. He will wait and strike once more, somewhere where the world must acknowledge his ingenuity." I watched him, half in admiration, half in concern. His eyes shone with that peculiar brilliance which always foretold a climax. "And you mean to stop him?" "I mean to anticipate him," Holmes replied. "He has lost his accomplices. Greaves dead by his own cowardice, Mrs. Pike vanished into the river, Rokes in prison. He will require new agents. I intend to be one of them." The audacity of the plan stunned me. "Holmes, you cannot mean—" "I mean precisely what I say. The criminal genius who built a room that vanished believes himself untraceable. But he is also a man of intellect, and such men respect intellect in others. He will seek me out again, Watson, not with a knife this time, but with an invitation." Within the week, events moved with startling rapidity. The newspapers, which had somehow caught wind of the affair despite Lestrade's efforts at secrecy, blazed forth with sensational headlines. "Attempt on Sherlock Holmes's life. Ingenious trap in Baker Street." Holmes read the reports with a faint smile. "Excellent. The bait is taken." That afternoon, a letter arrived. Its envelope bore no stamp, merely my friend's name written in an elegant, flowing hand. He opened it with his usual composure, though I saw the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes as he read. "You survived. I am pleased. The world would be poorer without you. I propose a meeting, neutral ground, no weapons, no police. Come alone to the Lantern Room of St. Bride's, Fleet Street, at 11 tomorrow night. There, the room will appear one last time, and the truth will be known." It was unsigned. Lestrade begged Holmes not to go, but argument was useless. "I shall attend," he said firmly. "If our opponent desires theatre, we must give him an audience. Only thus can the curtain be brought down." The next night was one of biting cold, with the moon like burnished silver over the rooftops. Holmes insisted I accompany him only part way. "Your presence would alter the balance," he said. "He seeks me, not us, but remain near enough to intervene if I fail to return by midnight." Thus it was that I found myself crouched in the shadow of St. Bride's churchyard, my revolver hidden beneath my coat, watching the spire rise ghost-like against the sky. The city was hushed save for the tolling of distant bells. I saw Holmes ascend the stone steps to the tower and vanish within. The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed faintly through the still air. Minutes dragged by with unbearable slowness. The church clock struck 11, then the quarter. Suddenly, a dim light glimmered through the narrow slits of the lantern room high above. A shadow moved across it, Holmes's silhouette, unmistakable in its sharp outline. Then another figure joined him. The light wavered, dimmed, and went out. I waited no longer. Heart pounding, I rushed to the tower door. It was locked. I hammered, shouted his name. No answer. Seizing a fallen beam from the yard, I forced the door open and dashed up the spiral stairs. The air within was stifling, the darkness absolute save for a faint gleam ahead. At last, I burst into the lantern room and stopped short. The chamber was bare, save for a single wooden chair in the center and a lantern upon the floor. Against the far wall stood Holmes, calm and upright, while before him lounged a tall man in a long black coat, his gloved hands resting lightly upon a cane. His face, when he turned it toward me, was pale, intellectual, and strangely familiar. "Ah, Dr. Watson," he said pleasantly. "Punctual as ever. You arrive at the moment of revelation." Holmes's voice was icy. "Watson, may I present Mr. Ambrose Charon, architect, mathematician, and, as I have long suspected, the author of our little puzzle." The man bowed slightly. "Your deduction honors me, Mr. Holmes. I have followed your work with admiration. It seemed fitting that you should one day encounter a problem of my own design." "Your design," Holmes said, "has cost lives." "A small price for perfection," the man replied. "You see, I do not kill for profit, but for proof. To create a room that appears only once, that is art, not crime. You interfered with my first attempt. I offer you now the chance to witness the final one." He touched the wall behind him. A section moved soundlessly, revealing an inner recess. Within it stood a framework of beams and panels, half constructed, like the skeleton of a room waiting to be born. "You see," Karen said softly, "the mechanism is simplicity itself. In an hour, this wall will close, and the chamber will vanish. You and I, Mr. Holmes, shall be inside it. The world will say that Sherlock Holmes entered St. Bride's and never emerged." I sprang forward, but Holmes's gesture halted me. His eyes never left the other man. "You forget one point, Karen," he said evenly. "An artist may master structure, but never conscience." As he spoke, his hand flicked to his pocket. A brilliant flash of light filled the room, the magnesium flare of his concealed lantern. Karen cried out, blinded, and staggered back. Holmes leapt upon him. There was a brief struggle. Then the man reeled against the open recess. The mechanism, disturbed, shifted with a groan. Panels swung inward, trapping him within his own device. "Watson! Out!" Holmes shouted. We dashed down the stairway as a thunderous crash echoed above us. Dust and splinters rained from the ceiling. Outside, the cold air struck my face like a blessing. Moments later, Lestrade's men, alerted by my signal, came running from their posts. Together, we re-entered the tower. The lantern room was a ruin. Amid the wreckage lay Charon, pinned beneath the beams of his collapsing invention, his final masterpiece. He was quite dead. Holmes looked down at him gravely. "He built his own tomb," he said. "The room has appeared for the last time." We stood in silence as the dawn broke over Fleet Street, pale light streaming through the shattered walls. Then Holmes turned to me with a weary smile. "Come, Watson, let us go home. I think, for once, the city may sleep without fear of walls that move in the night." And so ended the adventure of the room that appeared only once. A tale of vanity and genius, of architecture turned to murder, and of the one man whose intellect could pierce its secret. Even now, when I pass St. Bride's and see the glint of morning upon its spire, I fancy I can still hear the faint echo of hammering, as though somewhere in the depths of London, the architect of illusions continues his work in silence. For several days after the tragic conclusion at St. Bride's, Holmes and I lived in a strange quiet. The newspapers clamoured for details of the affair, but the police, at Holmes's suggestion, released only the barest account. Architect found dead in church tower, suspected lunatic. That was the sum of the public report, and London, ever greedy for novelty, soon turned its attention elsewhere. Yet within the walls of Baker Street, the echo of that case lingered like smoke after a fire. Holmes spoke little. He spent hours at the window, his long fingers idly tracing the frost upon the glass, his mind evidently far removed from the familiar view of hansoms and newsboys. Once, when I ventured to remark that the city owed him a debt for ridding it of such a menace, he turned toward me with a curious expression. "Do you think it's so simple, Watson? That evil dies with the hand that wrought it? No, my dear fellow. Ideas, once loosed upon the world, possess an immortality of their own. Charon built his rooms not merely to conceal crimes, but to conceive them, to show what cunning and patience could achieve when freed from conscience. Such an idea does not perish in a single collapse of timber and plaster. It will find imitators, as genius always does, whether for good or ill." I saw that argument was futile, and contented myself with keeping a watchful eye on my friend. The strain of the past months had left its mark. The fine lines at his temples had deepened, and there was a shadow in his eyes that no victory could quite dispel. It was on the fourth morning after the affair that Mrs. Hudson brought in a letter. "From the police, Mr. Holmes," she said. The handwriting, bold and slanting, was Lestrade's. Holmes broke the seal and read in silence, then handed the sheet across to me. "Dear Mr. Holmes, we have concluded our inquest on the body found at St. Bride's. The man's real name was Edward Charon, once registered as an architect in Vienna, expelled for irregular conduct and suspected of espionage during the War of '66. The Austrian authorities have confirmed that he was reported drowned in the Danube some years ago, an identity he evidently resumed under your very nose. One further matter. In the debris of the church, we discovered a sealed envelope bearing your initials. It contained only a visiting card on which was written a single Latin phrase, Ars est celare artem. I take it this means something to you. Yours in confidence, Inspector Lestrade." Holmes smiled faintly as he returned the letter to the table. "Art is to conceal art," he translated. "A fitting epitaph for such a man. The last salute of a craftsman to his adversary." He leaned back, and for the first time in days, a spark of his old humor touched his features. "Watson, do you recall my remark that he would leave his signature? Even in death he has done so. The irony would amuse him." From that moment his spirits began to mend. He turned again to his violin, to his experiments, and to the morning papers, which soon offered smaller puzzles to engage his restless intellect. Yet the shadow of Karen's strange genius still lingered, and from time to time he would speak of it, half to himself. "Do you know, Watson," he said one evening, "that I can almost admire him. To imagine a crime so elaborate, an architectural illusion serving as a weapon. Had he chosen the path of science instead of vanity, his name might have stood beside Brunel's or Telford's. But pride, Watson, pride is the acid that eats through intellect, destroys even genius." We had just settled to our reading when there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes tore it open, and a flash of surprise crossed his face. "From Lestrade again?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, from the French Sûreté. Listen to this. Curious case at Marseille. Murder in locked room. Walls recently altered. Local architect missing. Circumstances recall your case of the vanished room. Request your presence." I sprang to my feet. Surely this cannot be. Another imitator. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the old fire. Perhaps, or perhaps the echo of the master's hand. Whatever the truth, it will not allow us to rest idle. That same night, we were on the boat train for Dover. The channel crossing was rough, and the wind bit through our coats as we stood upon the deck, the dark waters foaming beneath. Holmes, however, seemed in his element once more. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing toward the faint lights of the French coast. "How swiftly evil crosses borders. The police of every nation chase the body of crime, but the spirit travels unimpeded. It is an international contagion." We reached Marseille 2 days later, and were met by Inspector Duval of the Sûreté, a brisk, courteous man with the neatness of a soldier. He conducted us at once to the scene of the tragedy, a merchant's villa overlooking the harbour. The details, though grotesque, were undeniably familiar. The victim, a wealthy broker named Lemaitre, had been found dead in his study, apparently from suffocation. The windows were barred, the door bolted from within. More curious still, one wall bore signs of recent plasterwork, though no structural change was recorded. When the police broke through, they discovered a narrow void between the walls, enough to conceal a man or an apparatus. Within that space lay the missing architect, crushed by the collapse of his own contrivance. Holmes examined the remains with grim satisfaction. "You see, Watson, a repetition of the principle, concealment through illusion. The dead architect was perhaps a disciple of Karen's school. The design, though clever, lacked his master's precision. Imperfect symmetry led to the failure." Inspector Duval regarded him with awe. But how could such a man learn these secrets? "From a teacher," Holmes replied, and there was but one. That night, as we returned to our hotel, Holmes remained thoughtful. "This proves my theory," he said at last. "Karen's idea survives him. He may have written papers, plans, handed down among his followers. If so, there exists a brotherhood of builders who construct not houses, but graves." His words chilled me. "Surely, Holmes, you exaggerate. One fanatic cannot found a cult." He smiled faintly. "Do you recall, Watson, that Archimedes once destroyed an entire fleet with mirrors? Ideas, my dear fellow, are stronger than armies. The notion of the perfect concealment. What criminal could resist it? The next morning, before we left Marseille, Holmes obtained permission to search the dead architect's rooms. In a locked drawer of his desk, we found a packet of letters written in a hand that neither of us had seen before, yet whose tone was unmistakable. "Read, Watson," said Holmes. The first ran, "My pupil, perfection demands heirs. The principles I have taught must not die with me. Seek simplicity, use geometry as your cloak. Remember always that the room must appear and vanish as thought does, suddenly and without trace. When the world understands, you will be its architect. C." Holmes folded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocketbook. "So, he did found a school," he murmured. "A society of illusionists, scattered perhaps across Europe. Their work may outlive us both, Watson." We left Marseille that afternoon, the Mediterranean sun glittering on the sea. Holmes stood upon the deck, his face grave yet composed. "I think, Watson," he said at last, "that we have not seen the end of rooms that appear only once. But for the present, let us take what comfort we may in the knowledge that we have delayed the next apparition. The future will provide others to finish what Karen began. Until then," he turned toward me with a faint smile, "we have earned a rest, and London awaits its consulting detective." The gulls wheeled above us, and the great ship turned northward, leaving a trail of white across the blue. I watched my friend's lean figure against the sunlight and felt, with a strange certainty, that though this adventure was concluded, the shadow it cast would follow us for years to come. Our return to London was subdued. Though the voyage home was calm and the early spring air soft upon the Thames, Holmes remained preoccupied. His thoughts turned inward to some problem beyond my reach. He spoke little during the journey, save to remark once that an idea, once born, has the resilience of life itself. I did not press him further. I had long since learned that his mind must move at its own pace, and that silence, not questioning, was its proper nourishment. We reached Baker Street late on a cool March evening. The familiar rooms seemed smaller after the vastness of the sea and the sun-washed expanse of the Mediterranean. Yet, to me, the sight of Holmes's armchair, the worn rug before the fire, and Mrs. Hudson's cheerful lamp upon the mantel brought a sense of comfort that no foreign landscape could equal. Holmes greeted them with a curt nod, then threw himself into his chair and stretched his long legs toward the fire. "Home again, Watson," he said quietly. "How strange that one may travel half the world and find that evil has already beaten him to his doorstep. You still believe this school of illusionists, as you call it, exists?" I asked. "Believe it? My dear fellow, I have proof of it." He leaned forward and drew from his pocket the packet of letters we had recovered in Marseille. "The handwriting is Charon's, of course, but see here, this one bears a London address written in a different hand." He passed me a slip of paper. It read, "To Mr. C, from your obedient servant, H.G. Lambeth." Beneath were several lines of coded figures. Holmes tapped the page with his forefinger. "Observe the signature, H.G. The style suggests an Englishman, not a foreigner. If my analysis is correct, this man was Charon's contact in London, perhaps his first pupil. The initials might stand for Henry Galt, an architect who vanished from his firm 5 years ago, leaving behind an unfinished design for a new wing at the South Kensington Museum. The plans were so eccentric that his partners destroyed them as the work of a madman. You see how the pattern returns. And you think this man still lives? I think, said Holmes, rising and pacing the room, that he has never ceased working. The hand that builds a wall to vanish once will build again, Watson, always with greater daring. It is the nature of obsession. He halted abruptly at the window. There is one clue I mean to test. In the letter from Marseille, the phrase "seek simplicity" appears. That, you will recall, was Charon's creed. It suggests that the new disciple follows the same architectural philosophy. Plain facades concealing elaborate interiors. We shall see if Lambeth holds such a structure. The next day found us in the southern district of London, where narrow lanes of warehouses and workshops wound among the grey waters of the river. Holmes led the way with his habitual certainty, consulting a notebook as he went. At last, we stopped before a building of curious design. A two-story house of yellow brick with windows evenly spaced and a modest brass plate inscribed Henry Galt, Surveyor. Holmes examined the facade minutely, then turned to me with a gleam in his eye. You perceive, Watson, the very virtue of its simplicity. It proclaims respectability, an office of no importance. Yet the proportions are oddly exact, too exact for chance. I fancy the interior is of a different order. We knocked. After some delay, a man of middle years opened the door. His hair was iron grey, his manner composed, but there was a quickness in his eyes that betrayed an inner alertness. "Mr. Galt?" Holmes asked politely. The man inclined his head. "That is my name. How may I serve you, gentlemen?" Holmes presented a card. "We are seeking an expert in unusual building methods. Your reputation, I believe, extends beyond Lambeth." The faintest smile touched Galt's lips. "You flatter me, sir. I am a humble surveyor, nothing more." "Indeed," said Holmes softly. "And yet, I think you were once a student of Edward Charon." For the first time, the man's composure faltered. "I do not know the name." "Then allow me to refresh your memory," Holmes said, drawing from his pocket the letter from Marseille. "The handwriting is yours. The police recovered it from the body of a certain architect whose work you would recognize." Galt's eyes flickered toward the street, but Holmes's tone hardened. "You are surrounded, Mr. Galt. Scotland Yard's men wait at each corner. You would be wise to speak plainly." A silence followed. Then, with a strange resignation, Galt said, "Come in." The interior of the house was unlike any I had ever seen. The walls were bare, but the ceilings soared upward in geometric arches, and the light from high windows cast patterns that seemed to move as one walked. It was a place half workshop, half cathedral. Upon a table lay sheets of drawings and models, structures so intricate that I could scarcely follow their purpose. Holmes surveyed them with keen interest. "Remarkable," he murmured. "You have improved upon your master's methods." Galt gave a short, bitter laugh. "Improved? I have surpassed him. He dreamed of illusion. I have achieved it. Do you see this model? It represents a building without fixed dimensions, a house that expands or contracts according to the position of its walls. You may walk its corridors and never know if you move in circles or straight lines. It is the architecture of the mind, Mr. Holmes." "And to what end?" asked Holmes. "To hide another crime, to prove another madness." "To escape both," Galt said fiercely. Karen was a fool. He built for others. I build for myself. The world hunts me, but it will never find me. When my final work is complete, I shall vanish into it. The door will close, and there will be nothing left. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And where will this masterpiece stand? Galt smiled, a thin, secretive smile. You will see it soon enough, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps you will even be its guest. Before we could move, he pressed a lever concealed beneath the table. The floor beneath our feet shuddered, and a section of the wall swung outward, revealing a dark corridor beyond. Galt stepped back toward it, his face illuminated by a single shaft of light. Farewell, he said. You cannot arrest an idea. Holmes sprang forward, but the wall closed with a soundless motion. We searched the room, the passage, the entire building, but he was gone. The corridor ended in a blank wall of brick. There was no exit, no sign of escape. It was as though he had melted into his own invention. Holmes stood silent, his face pale with awe and anger. He has done it, he said at last. The perfect concealment. The room that appears only once, and now the architect himself has disappeared within it. That night, back at Baker Street, he sat long into the early hours, his eyes fixed upon the dying fire. Watson, he said finally, Karen built rooms to deceive others. Galt has built one to deceive the world. I fear we have not seen the last of him. Somewhere, behind some ordinary wall in this great city, he walks unseen, listening to the footsteps that pass him by. And as the first light of dawn touched the windows, I could not shake the feeling that the very walls around us held their breath, as though another architect's hand might even then be at work, crafting yet again the room that appeared only once. For many weeks after our encounter with Henry Galt, Holmes withdrew almost entirely from public life. The affair of the vanishing architect had disturbed even his iron composure. He refused all new cases, declined invitations from Scotland Yard, and devoted himself instead to long, solitary walks through the fog-laden streets of London. I could not persuade him to speak of the matter, though more than once I found him studying architectural drawings or tracing invisible lines upon the table with his long, nervous fingers. Watson, he said one morning, breaking a silence of several hours. The danger of confronting genius is that it forces one to measure the limits of one's own mind. Galt was not merely a criminal. He was an intellect distorted by pride. He vanished into his own creation, and in doing so, he proved a principle that may yet ruin others. The temptation to disappear is very strong in men of our profession. I was alarmed by his tone. You speak as though you admired him. Holmes gave a short laugh. Admiration, my dear Watson, is not approval. A mathematician may marvel at a problem even when it threatens to consume him. That night, he left Baker Street without explanation and did not return until dawn. His coat was powdered with dust, and his eyes had the gleam that I had learned to associate with discovery. Watson, he said quietly, I have found the site. The site of Galt's final work. He did not disappear into the air. He disappeared into brick and stone. There is a derelict warehouse by the river at Millbank. It was purchased under an alias 2 years ago and has stood empty ever since. Yet last night I saw a light burning within it, and, more curious still, I heard the sound of hammering. It appears our architect continues his labours. We set out together that evening. The sky hung low and yellow over the Thames, and the tide lapped sluggishly against the embankment. The warehouse stood apart from its neighbours, a hulking shadow with boarded windows and a single door secured by a rusted chain. Holmes examined the lock by lantern light. "New," he murmured. "Fitted within the week. The man has been here recently." He produced a small file and within moments had removed the chain. We entered. The air inside was chill and stale, thick with dust. The lantern's beam caught the outlines of wooden scaffolds, discarded tools, and sheets of paper pinned to the walls. Upon these papers were drawings, hundreds of them, showing elevations, cross-sections, and impossible geometries that made the eye ache to follow. Holmes moved among them like a scholar in a forbidden library. "It is as I suspected," he said softly. "Galt has taken Charon's principle to its ultimate form. These plans describe a structure that folds upon itself, walls that slide and pivot, floors that alter their incline, corridors that return to their own beginning. A labyrinth, Watson, with no fixed center." We had scarcely advanced 10 paces when a faint creak echoed through the darkness. The door behind us had closed. I turned sharply, but the way was gone. The wall was seamless. Holmes's face remained composed, though I saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. He anticipated us. We have entered his machine. A low vibration filled the air, and the floor beneath us began to move. The boards shifted like a tide, carrying us forward into a narrowing corridor. The lantern flickered wildly, throwing grotesque shadows along the walls. "Keep close to me, Watson," Holmes commanded. "If the mechanism follows his drawings, there will be a pivot point, a chamber from which all others radiate. That must be the heart of the design." We pressed onward through twist-out passages that seemed to alter their dimensions as we walked. Once, the corridor widened into a small room furnished only with a wooden chair and a writing desk. Upon it lay a notebook open to a single page. In the wavering light, I read, "To pursue the infinite, one must first confine the finite. The perfect architect builds a house for the mind and seals it from the world." Holmes closed the book. He intends this to be his tomb. We moved again. The air grew stifling. Somewhere, unseen machinery clicked and turned, and the walls glided almost imperceptibly inward. My nerves, steeled though they were by years of adventure, began to tremble. At last, we reached a circular chamber, its walls smooth and unbroken, save for a single brass lever set into the floor. Holmes examined it, his face alight with comprehension. "This is the fulcrum," he said. "A single movement here determines the alignment of the entire structure. If we reverse the mechanism, it should restore the original configuration and, with luck, reopen the exit." He gripped the lever and pulled. There came a deep, resonant clang, followed by a shudder that ran through the walls like a sigh. The air shifted. A faint draft touched my face. "This way!" Holmes cried, seizing the lantern and leading the way down a newly formed passage. Moments later, we emerged into the open night. The door through which we had entered now stood ajar, and the first grey light of dawn crept across the river. I drew a long breath of relief. Holmes turned back toward the building, his expression grave. "We are fortunate, Watson. Another hour and the mechanism might have completed its cycle. I doubt we should have found the same door again." We reported our discovery to Lestrade, who arrived with a detachment of constables before noon. But when they searched the warehouse, they found it utterly transformed. The walls no longer matched our account. The inner chambers had disappeared as though they had never existed. Of Galt himself, there was no trace. Only the notebook remained, its final entry newly written. Perfection achieved. The architect has entered his own design. Holmes read the words in silence. He has done it, he said at last. He has made himself the ghost of his own creation. No man will ever find him now. Lestrade shook his head. Then we must seal the place and be done with it. A lunatic's folly. Holmes made no reply. He stood a long while upon the embankment, gazing at the blank facade of the warehouse. "Watson," he said quietly, "if walls can swallow men, what hope has reason against madness? He has solved the riddle of disappearance. And yet, what has he gained? The room that appeared only once now holds its creator, and I fancy it will never open again." That night, as we sat by our fire at Baker Street, the wind moaned along the chimney and the shadows quivered upon the walls. Holmes seemed lost in thought. At length he spoke. "There are mysteries, my dear Watson, which even the keenest mind must leave unsolved. The limits of reason end where imagination begins, and beyond that frontier lies the architect's domain." He turned his gaze toward the dim corners of the room, and for the first time I fancied that even Holmes looked upon the walls of Baker Street with a trace of doubt, as though he too half expected them to stir and whisper in the night. The case of the vanished architect left its shadow over Baker Street for many weeks. Holmes, though outwardly composed, betrayed an inward restlessness that no ordinary problem could dispel. His violin lay untouched in its corner, his pipe often went out between his fingers, and his gaze lingered too long upon the fire, as though he read there some cipher invisible to me. Even Mrs. Hudson remarked upon his abstraction, though she attributed it to the dampness of the spring and the wickedness of London weather. For myself, I confess that the adventure of the warehouse had shaken my composure more deeply than I cared to admit. The thought of those shifting walls, that living maze of timber and brick, haunted my sleep. Often I would wake with the sense of being enclosed, as if the room itself had altered in the night. Holmes, with his more powerful imagination, must have suffered doubly, yet he made no complaint. It was in the first week of April that the silence was broken by a visit from Inspector Lestrade. He entered our sitting room with a face of mingled pride and perplexity. "I think, Mr. Holmes, we've found your man," he announced. Holmes looked up sharply. "Galt?" "The same, or what's left of him." Lestrade laid a folded paper upon the table. "Workmen dredging near Millbank came upon this morning's curiosity, a section of brickwork, hollow, with a man's remains inside. The wall seems to have been part of some collapsed foundation. Judging by the tools and fragments, I'd wager he built his coffin with his own hands. There's no doubt it's your architect." Holmes studied the paper without comment. After a moment, he rose and fetched his hat. "Come, Watson. We shall see the end with our own eyes." The river at Millbank was swollen with rain. By the time we arrived, a small crowd had gathered about a cluster of constables and labourers. In the centre lay a heap of debris, timbers, plaster, and a crumbling section of wall. The remains within were scarcely more than bone, yet beside them lay a notebook wrapped in oilcloth, and on its cover the initials HG were still discernible. Holmes knelt beside the grim relic, his expression unreadable. "He built his perfection indeed," he murmured. The room closed upon him, and he became part of it. Lestrade crossed himself. "There's madness for you. The cleverest brains turn the wrong way, and the devil builds a monument out of their folly." Holmes made no reply. He slipped the notebook into his coat. "You may leave the rest to me, Inspector. The dead man's words may explain what his lips cannot." That evening, as the fog thickened outside and the city sank into its familiar murmur, Holmes sat reading the recovered volume. I watched his face as he turned each page, and once or twice I caught the faint tightening of his mouth. When at last he looked up, his voice was grave. "Watson, this book is less a confession than a manifesto. Listen." He read aloud. "A house must live, as a man lives. When the mind withdraws, the body collapses. I shall fuse the two and create a dwelling that obeys its maker's thought. It shall close when I command, open when I will, and when I die, it shall die with me. Thus will the architect and his art become one." He closed the notebook with a sigh. You see, the man's intellect had turned inward until it devoured itself. There was method even in his madness. "And now it's finished," I said. "Finished?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, an idea does not perish in a single grave. The principles he set down here are complete, precise, and, if one were so inclined, reproducible." I started. "Surely you do not mean—" "I mean that others, less scrupulous but equally curious, might build again. Do you suppose no ambitious engineer, no secret society, would find fascination in a design that makes disappearance possible? The temptation will prove irresistible. There are men in London this very hour who would trade a fortune for such a scheme." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that cold fire which always presaged his deductions. "And yet, there is a way to prevent it. Knowledge can be destroyed as well as preserved." Before I could question him, he rose abruptly, tore several pages from the notebook, and cast them into the fire. The flames leapt high, devouring the sketches and formulae. "Holmes!" I cried. "That is evidence." "Evidence of what? A dead man's delusion? No, Watson, this is mercy. Let his secret die with him. There are enough weapons in the world without adding the science of invisibility to its arsenal." We sat in silence as the last fragments curled to ash. At length, Holmes spoke again, more softly. "Do you recall what I said the night we found Karen's body? That ideas have their own immortality? It is true, but even ideas require soil in which to grow. Burn the seed, and the crop may fail." The following days passed uneventfully. Spring touched London with its uncertain sunlight, and Holmes appeared once more in his accustomed spirits. He resumed correspondence with the Yard, consulted upon a forgery case, and even condescended to attend a concert at St. James's Hall, where his keen appreciation of music momentarily displaced all darker thoughts. Yet I could not help noticing that he had developed a new habit of measuring the rooms of Baker Street with his eye, as if verifying their proportions. One evening, while I was writing in my journal, he said suddenly, "Watson, if you were to conceal a man in plain sight, not by hiding him, but by altering the space around him, how would you proceed?" I looked up, startled. "I should not proceed at all. The very notion is unnatural." He smiled. "Precisely. unnatural, and therefore fascinating. Before I could remonstrate, he continued, "Fear not, my friend. I have no intention of reviving Galt's madness, but there is value in understanding one's enemy. To dismantle a snare, one must know how it is made." A few days later, Lestrade called again. "We've finished with that warehouse, Mr. Holmes," he reported. "The place is coming down next week. The owners want it gone before someone else vanishes inside. But we found something you might like to see." From his pocket, he produced a small metal plate engraved with fine lettering. Holmes examined it, and I saw the faintest tremor pass over his features. The inscription read, "The room that appears only once. London, 1898. Holmes turned it over in his hands. He named his work Watson, a title for his tomb. He saw himself as an artist to the last. Lestrade shook his head. "A mad artist, if you ask me. The place will be rubble by Friday." When he had gone, Holmes replaced the plate upon the mantelpiece and stood gazing at it for a long while. Then he said, half to himself, "There are monuments of stone, and there are monuments of thought. This one, perhaps, is both." That night, I dreamt of walls that breathed and corridors that whispered. When I woke, Holmes was still by the fire, the metal plate gleaming beside him. Dawn was breaking over London, and for a fleeting instant, the rising sun touched the wall of our sitting room with a shifting glow, as though it, too, might stir and change. Holmes glanced toward it, his expression unreadable. "Watson," he said quietly, "if ever this room should appear only once, let us hope it is because we have seen enough of its kind." He turned away, and the light faded, leaving only the steady, familiar outlines of Baker Street. Yet, in the silence that followed, I could not help but feel that the city beyond our windows, vast, secretive, and full of hidden chambers, was already building new walls around some future mystery that only Holmes himself would be able to uncover. The spring of that year passed into summer, and London, swathed in its usual haze of smoke and sunlight, appeared to forget the grim tale of the vanished architect. Yet Holmes, though outwardly restored to his old vigor, carried within him a quiet vigilance, as though he expected at any moment to hear the echo of a hammer striking within the city's walls. His mind, ever restless, could not wholly release its grasp upon the problem. It was not the man, but the idea that held him, a spectre of intellect that no arrest or death could banish. "Watson," he said one morning as we breakfasted, "London is the greatest organism ever constructed by human hands. It lives, it breathes, it devours, and, like all living things, it hides its secrets in its own flesh. When men such as Curran or Galt manipulate its structure, they do not merely build, they imitate nature herself. I sometimes wonder whether the city might one day conceal us all." "Holmes," I protested, "you grow fanciful." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps, yet I cannot help but think that the final solution to our mystery has not yet presented itself. That very afternoon, chance, or fate, brought fresh evidence to our door. A letter arrived from the office of the Home Secretary requesting Holmes's immediate presence. We went at once to Whitehall, where we were ushered into the minister's private room. The great man's expression was grave. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I have before me a matter of such peculiarity that I can confide it only to your discretion. 3 nights ago, a confidential agent of the government disappeared from his lodgings in Bloomsbury. His room was found perfectly intact, the door locked from within, and no sign of disturbance. Yet the man was gone. The landlord swears that at dawn, the wall itself seemed altered. New plaster, a fresh seam running from floor to ceiling. It was as though part of the room had been built over in the night. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "You have inspected it yourself, sir?" "I have. It is extraordinary. The police believe the fellow fled abroad, but there are those who suspect foul play. His papers were of national importance. Mr. Holmes, this bears every mark of your recent case, the so-called room that appeared only once." Holmes's eyes kindled. "Indeed, Minister, it bears more than a resemblance. It is its successor." Within the hour, we were at the address given, a respectable boarding house in Great Ormond Street. The landlady, a nervous widow, led us up to the second floor and flung open the door of the missing man's room. To my astonishment, it was precisely as she had described. Ordinary in furnishing, but with one wall curiously smooth and new, the plaster still faintly damp. Holmes's examination was swift and methodical. He moved from corner to corner, tapping, measuring, scraping at the surface with his knife. At one point he knelt, peering close to a small irregularity near the skirting board. "Fresh dust," he murmured. The work was done within 3 days. "Observe, Watson, how the pattern of the wallpaper has been skillfully copied, though the join is misaligned by the breadth of a hair. The craftsman was hasty or frightened." "Then you believe the wall conceals something? Or someone?" He turned sharply to the landlady. "Who occupied the room beside this one?" "No one, sir. It has stood empty since Easter." "Then, Watson," said Holmes, "we shall occupy it ourselves for the next hour." With the woman's reluctant permission, we entered the adjoining chamber. It was bare, save for a few crates and a table thick with dust. Holmes struck a match and examined the dividing wall. "Precisely the same construction," he said. "Note the faint hollowness when I tap here. The space between these two walls cannot exceed 2 feet. If our man lies within, we shall soon know it." He produced a small chisel from his coat and began carefully to pry at the plaster. Within minutes, a section gave way, revealing darkness beyond. A foul, stagnant odor escaped. Holmes thrust his lantern through the opening, and its light fell upon a narrow recess. There, upright as though frozen in mid-step, stood the missing agent, his face pale and rigid. The landlady shrieked and fled down the passage. Holmes climbed through the gap, examining the ghastly figure with professional calm. "No mark of violence," he observed. "The expression suggests suffocation, not struggle. The air must have been exhausted when the wall was sealed." He turned to me. "You see, Watson, the architect's art has found a new patron. The question is, who continues it?" A constable fetched by the terrified landlady soon arrived, followed by Lestrade. The body was removed, and Holmes spent the remainder of the afternoon in close consultation with the inspector. When we returned to Baker Street that evening, the evidence lay spread before him. A fragment of plaster, a smear of paint, and a crumpled note found in the victim's pocket. Holmes examined the paper under his lens. "The handwriting is distinctive," he said. "Long, looping characters, and see here, the initial G. It is not Henry Galt's hand, yet it mimics his style with deliberate care. Our new enemy, I think, wishes to be mistaken for his predecessor." "But for what purpose?" I asked. "To frighten, to mystify, to claim the legacy of genius." I suspect that somewhere in London, an ambitious imitator has studied Galt's notebooks before they were destroyed, or perhaps copied them beforehand. Such men do not die without leaving disciples. He rose and paced the room. Mark my words, Watson. This will not be the last wall to move in London. The method is too seductive, the effect too absolute. A man may vanish without trace, leaving only the illusion of ordinary architecture. It is the perfect crime. For several days, Holmes pursued his inquiries with relentless energy. Builders, plasterers, and architects were questioned. Lists of recent renovations were examined. At last, his efforts bore fruit. A foreman employed on the Bloomsbury house confessed that he had been paid in cash by a gentleman of foreign accent to perform the work at night under strict secrecy. The address he gave was that of a small office near the Strand, registered, as Holmes discovered, to a company called Edificium Limited. Latin again, Holmes muttered. Edificium, the building. How consistent our enemy is in his irony. That evening we visited the premises. The office was deserted, the air heavy with dust, but on the wall behind a roll-top desk hung a framed plan of a house, its design a maze of interlocking rooms, every line precise, every measurement exact. Beneath it, written in neat script, was a single phrase: perfection is never solitary. Holmes stared at it for a long time. There it is, Watson, the creed of a brotherhood. The architects multiply. Galt was but the first of a lineage. He turned toward the door. We have pulled one brick from a wall that spans Europe. Somewhere beyond London, others are building. Silent, tireless, invisible. It may take years to find them, but find them we shall. As we stepped out into the night, I could not help but glance back at the dimly lit windows of the office. The fog rolled in from the river, softening every outline until even the buildings seemed uncertain of their own shape. Holmes's voice came low beside me. Take note, Watson. When the very walls of London begin to deceive, truth itself must rely upon those who still believe in its straight lines. And as we turned toward Baker Street, I could not rid myself of the thought that somewhere, in the endless sprawl of the city, another wall was already being built. One that would again appear only once, and perhaps never open to daylight again. It was several weeks after the discovery in Great Ormond Street that the final act of this strange history unfolded. London had settled into the uneasy calm of early autumn, that peculiar stillness which precedes its darker months, when fogs begin to coil along the river and the city takes on its old mysterious aspect. Holmes was again his active self, but I knew by the glint in his eyes and the quick, restless energy of his movements that his mind still labored upon the mystery of the unseen architects. He would spend long hours at his desk, poring over maps of London, marking certain districts with his pencil, then erasing them again. There is pattern, Watson, he said more than once. The mind that governs this conspiracy builds not at random. The sites, Fitzroy Square, Millbank, Bloomsbury, form a sequence, a kind of geometric progression. Each is chosen for its proportion, its distance from the next, as though the city itself were being reshaped by invisible hands. One morning, while the air outside was thick with drizzle, a telegram arrived. Holmes read it in silence, then handed it across. Another disappearance, same method, warehouse by Holborn Viaduct. Police baffled. Come at once. Lestrade. Holmes sprang up, his face illuminated by that fierce light of intellectual challenge which I knew so well. The walls move again, Watson. The pattern continues. This may be our last opportunity to end it. The warehouse stood near the junction of Farringdon Street, a dreary, soot-blackened building surrounded by a narrow court. The constables on guard saluted as we entered. Within, the scene was one of eerie familiarity. The room was large and bare, but along one side stretched a newly plastered wall whose surface gleamed damply in the light of the lamps. Lestrade, looking harassed, greeted us with evident relief. "It's the same trick, Mr. Holmes. We found the owner gone, vanished clean away. The men say there was noise in the night, hammering and such. But by morning, nothing." Holmes examined the wall with minute attention, pressing his ear against the plaster, tapping lightly with his cane. After a moment, he turned to me. "You hear that, Watson? The faint echo. Hollow, not solid. There's a cavity beyond." He motioned for the constables to stand clear, then seized a crowbar from a nearby crate and struck sharply at the wall. The plaster cracked and a section fell away. The lantern's beam penetrated the gap, revealing a narrow recess. Inside was a small table, a lamp, and upon it a book bound in dark leather. Beside the table, slumped against the wall, sat the figure of a man, dead but seated upright, as though calmly awaiting discovery. Lestrade uttered an exclamation. "By heaven! It's him, the same as before." Holmes stepped forward, studying the corpse with his cool detachment. "No, Inspector, not quite the same. Note the hands, calloused, the nails blackened with lime. This man was a builder, not an agent. See also the paper beside him." He lifted a folded sheet and read aloud. "The circle is closed, the master's design fulfilled. London shall remember us when its walls breathe." Holmes replaced the paper, his lips compressed. "We are dealing with disciples indeed, perhaps even a society sworn to perpetuate Charon's and Galt's dream. But their meaning eludes me. Why should they choose to die within their own constructions?" Lestrade shook his head in bewilderment. "You talk of a society, Mr. Holmes, but there's nothing to prove it. Only these madmen sealing themselves up in walls. London's a graveyard of fools." "Perhaps," Holmes said quietly, "but fools do not work with compass and square. These men build by proportion, by law. It is their creed." He turned suddenly toward the far side of the room. "Watson, bring the lantern here." At the base of the opposite wall, faintly visible through a film of dust, ran a series of lines, precise geometrical figures inscribed in chalk, triangles intersecting circles, a complex pattern of angles. "Geometry again," Holmes murmured. "This is their signature. Every structure, every murder has borne some trace of mathematical design. These symbols, Watson, are not random. They form a code." For 2 hours he worked in silence, measuring the intervals between the figures, sketching them in his notebook. When at last he straightened, his expression was one of grim satisfaction. "The code leads here." He pointed to a mark resembling an arrow, its point directed toward the southeast. "It is a map of sorts. If I am not mistaken, it will guide us to the heart of their operations." We followed the trail the next evening. The line, as Holmes traced it, led from Holborn across the river to a cluster of derelict buildings near Southwark. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of a lamplighter's torch. At length, we came upon a tall windowless structure bearing a faint inscription above the door. Edificium Lantid, the same name we had seen in the Strand. Holmes's face hardened. The circle indeed closes. The door yielded easily to his touch, and we entered. The air was heavy, the darkness almost tangible. Holmes's lantern revealed a vast interior, divided by partitions of wood and plaster. Upon one wall hung a large drawing, the plan of London itself, crisscrossed with red lines connecting various points. "The geometry of their madness," Holmes whispered. "Each site we visited lies upon this pattern. When joined, they form a perfect circle encompassing the heart of the city. These men sought to turn London into their final work of art." A sudden sound, a faint footstep, made us turn. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, cloaked, the face obscured by a hood. "You are too late, Mr. Holmes," came a low voice. "The foundation is complete. The circle is closed." Holmes stepped forward. "Who are you?" "The last architect," the figure replied. "We build to endure. You destroy, yet what you destroy you cannot understand. When the city breathes, remember this. We warned you." Before we could move, the man struck a hidden lever. The floor shuddered, and a section of the wall began to descend, sealing the room. Holmes seized my arm. "Run, Watson!" We dashed through the maze as the walls shifted and closed behind us, the air thick with dust and falling debris. At last, a narrow doorway opened to the street, and we staggered into the open, just as the building collapsed inward with a thunderous roar. For a long moment we stood, breathless, watching as the dust rose in a great cloud against the skyline. When it cleared, the sight was nothing but a heap of rubble. Lestrade arrived moments later with his men. "Good Lord, Mr. Holmes, what happened?" Holmes wiped the grime from his face. "An end, Inspector, or perhaps a beginning. The last of the architects has vanished beneath his own design." That night, back in Baker Street, we sat before the fire in silence. Holmes held the recovered plan of London in his hands, the red lines still visible under the soot. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "they meant the city itself to be their masterpiece. A circle of vanishing points, rooms that appear and disappear, forming a design too vast for any one man to see. They believed that by completing it, they would transcend mortality." He tossed the map into the flames. "Let them rest in the dust they worshipped. London belongs to those who dwell above its ground, not within its walls." The fire crackled, consuming the paper. Outside, the wind stirred along Baker Street, and for a moment it seemed to me that the old house trembled, as though acknowledging the passing of something unseen. Holmes turned toward me, weary but calm. "Thus ends the affair of the room that appeared only once, Watson. May it never appear again." And with that, he reached for his violin, drawing from it a low, haunting note that lingered in the air long after the city outside had fallen silent.